HTML is a great way to output data, but it's also a great way to receive input from the user. In this video, we'll start learning about forms. So why might you want to build a form on a web page? Well, oftentimes, especially in web apps, you need to accept user input from the person that's visiting your website, rather than just having output with text and images. So let's go ahead and create our first HTML form. To do that, inside of the body tag, we're going to create the form element with an opening and closing tag. And first, we're going to apply a few attributes. First is the action attribute, which is required. The action attribute should point to the web page that you want to load after the form has been submitted by the user. So in this case, we're just going to put a hash symbol, but really, you're going to want to put a URL, or you're going to more likely want to point to another page on your website. But like I said, we're not going to have this submit to another page because we're not actually going to be able to process any data. In order to do that, we need to learn about server-side programming such as Ruby on Rails, PHP, or Python. We'll learn about that much later on. So that's the action attribute. Next is the method attribute. For the method attribute, you can type in post in all capital letters, or you can type get. This is a web programming concept that really doesn't matter a whole lot to us now, but again, once you start learning about server-side programming, that will make more sense. Then finally, we have the name attribute. This is the name of the form, and it's going to be my form for this particular form, but really you can have anything you want. All it needs to do is be descriptive, describing what the form actually does. The place that this information will show up in is in the server-side programming, once again. So when this form gets submitted, your web server will know which form actually got sent. So next, we're ready to move on and learn about the input element. Now, the input element is actually going to be what we're going to want to use for the majority of our form elements. It's very versatile, and we can modify what it does by using the type attribute. So in the type attribute, the first type of input we're going to learn about is called text. So we'll type in text, and we need to also give this a name. And for this one, we'll say username. So it can be assumed that the user would type in maybe a username that they might want if they were signing up for a service. So we'll save that, switch back to the browser, and refresh the page. And as you can see, we now have a little text box here that we can type into. So we might type a username in if we were signing up for a service. So next, let's go ahead and copy this input and paste it down below and change some of the attributes. Instead of a text input, let's type a password. And the name for this can be whatever you want, but just for clarity, we'll go ahead and type password here as well. And let's go ahead and put some line breaks here just to separate these two form elements. And when I switch back to the browser and refresh, you can see that we now have two text boxes. One, I could type a username into, and the second one would be a password. And of course, when you type any characters into a password field, you can't actually see what those characters are. Now, why would you want to use a password field instead of a text field for a password? Well, as obvious as that might seem, the reason you want to use this is so that nobody looking over your shoulder can see you typing in your password. However, when this is sent to the server, it will actually be in plain text, just like the username is. So if we switch back to our text editor, let's move on to radio buttons. So we'll go ahead and actually just copy and paste one of these inputs here. And let's change these attributes. So first, I'll change the type to say radio. And I'm going to change the name to gender. And the value is going to be male. Now, next to this radio button, I want to put some text just so we know what this radio button means. Because when you have a group of radio buttons together with no labels, it can get very confusing very quickly. So I'm going to actually copy this radio button and paste it one more time. And we're going to change the value here to female. And we'll go ahead and change our little label there next to it. And we're going to leave the rest of the attributes the same. That way, the browser will know that this is a radio button group, and it won't treat these radio buttons individually. So let me show you what I mean. First, let's save this out, switch back to the browser, and refresh. And as you can see, we now have these two radio buttons, male and female. And when I click one, the other will become deselected. Now let's see what happens if we actually don't give these the same name. We'll just change this name to something else, save it, switch back and refresh. And as you can see, I can now actually select both of these radio buttons at the same time, and the other one doesn't deselect. That's bad. For cases where you want to select multiple things, we want to use checkboxes, where you want to have a grouping of selections where you can only choose one item. You want to use radio buttons. And for that reason, it's important that we give them the same name so that they're in the same group. So next, let's move on to checkboxes. Now, checkboxes are very similar to radio buttons, but like I said, they allow you to select multiple items rather than a single item. So we're going to change the type attribute to say checkbox. And then again, we want to create a grouping of checkboxes, and we'll call this foods. And we'll change the value to grapes here. And we'll put a label beside it that says grapes. And we'll just create a few more of these and change both the value and the label. So we'll say apples and bananas. And then we'll just copy and paste those into our labels and save that out. Then we switch back to the browser, refresh, and as you can see, we now have these nice checkboxes here that, while they are part of the same group, you can still select multiple checkboxes. Finally, let's learn about the submit type, because, of course, if you have all this form data, you need a way to submit it. To do that, we'll use an input of the type submit, and we'll change the value here to say continue, save that out, switch back and refresh, and as you can see, we now have a continue button here. Now, of course, this button can say whatever we want. We'll change it to say onwards with an exclamation point, save it, refresh the page, and now we have this button that says onwards, and of course that can say whatever you want. Now, if we fill in some data here, and we'll just fill in some junk data really quickly, then we click the submit button, a couple things will happen here. First, you'll see that we went to the URL that is present in the action attribute of the form, which in this case is just a hash. However, you actually should put another URL there, and you'll learn more about that with server-side programming. The second thing that we see going on here is Google Chrome is asking us if we want to save the password we just submitted. Now, I'm just going to click the X and say no, but the reason it asked us that is because it recognized we actually just submitted a form that contains a password field. So it's important to use the correct data types here, because that will make it much easier to A, interact with the server more easily, and B, interact with the browser more easily. Now, my form fields here are styled based on Mac OS X. However, your forms may actually look slightly different, and that depends on your operating system. If you're using Windows, they'll look different. If you're using another version of macOS 10, they'll look different. Or if you're on a mobile browser, they'll actually look different. There's even variations between different browsers in some cases. However, usually it's based on the operating system. One last thing I would like to point out is it's fairly difficult to style form fields, at least traditionally, with CSS. And you'll probably want to actually just go with these default styles that are applied by the operating system whenever possible. That just about covers it for the input element, but there's still a lot more to learn about forms.